a good tornado. The photographs are good, and we supposedly have everything booted. And we are going to try and get a rocket in it. We're going slowly towards it, but we can see that it's somewhat unstable. And we're going to get as close as we can safely. Everything is checked. Computer is booted again. It is fantastic. We've already used up half the film here. We're still approaching it, and we don't care if that movie goes all the way to the end. It's too fantastic a sight to miss. We've got some rain there, which is screwing up the photography. There's no sign of any turbulence. We still have a little bit of the film left to go, and we are within firing range, although it's getting thinner. And fire. We missed.
Ranch School was a kind of special preparatory school that many parents in the East tried to send their kids to get a feeling for the outdoors and feeling for a top education. Top of that, you learned to ride. You didn't do team sports. You were always personally responsible for everything that you did. There was no way of blaming somebody else. And I happened to like that. But it was also a monastery too, no women. So naturally you spent most of your time figuring how you could get out of here. I came here in, 39? My brother was here. And just trying to really get through and get out. So in the sense of the closing of the school by the Manhattan Project was kind of music to all us kids. We could get out, get free, get on with life without being here in this really protected environment. After Pearl Harbor, we all knew we were kind of playing an end game. We got out of school and we're off to war. And so in the beginning of the fall of 42, was already surveyors were around here from the government. Then they took it over and they ran a kind of a mega bulldozer through the place. Absolutely fantastic construction in a very short length of time. We knew the school would be taken over, didn't know just when, didn't know what was really happening. And you know, you can't just kind of do that in a mental vacuum for a bunch of smart-ass kids. They just, I mean, you know, our current vernacular is give me a break. But in those days, don't try and fool me that much. So towards the end of this, just before Christmas, these two dudes show up here calling themselves Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. The first one wearing a pork pie and the second one a fedora. I mean, and talk about giving me a break, I mean, all these kids just, you know, the seniors, I was a senior then, what the hell would they want this godforsaken place for? What would the government want this for? No railroad, no water. Come on, well, they've had to spend a fortune on getting the water here, but they've never put the railroad. So when these two dudes showed up with all the colonels and admirals and generals and lots of colonels running around them and construction bosses, I mean, no way on Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. Who were they and what's the problem? Well, it took just 2 hours to know that this was Oppenheimer and Lawrence. And we called them by those names among us kids right then because we knew of them so well from our physics courses and things like that. Recognized their pictures in our physics book. So within, I'd say, 1 minute of that recognition, those of us who understood physics knew immediately it meant that the fission ratio was greater than 2. and therefore you could make fission, and therefore you could make a nuclear bomb. There was not any possible reason among us for any other reasonable explanation. You know, sure, it had a big impression on me, and naturally I kept thinking about it. When the school closed down at Christmas, Oppenheimer gave the commencement address and tried to convey the importance of what would be going on here. It kind of was a bit empty to some of us because we knew it was a lot more important than he could convey.
And so half a dozen or more seniors left Los Alamos Ranch School when it was closed down that Christmas in 42, 43, all knowing that a nuclear bomb was going to be made at Los Alamos, a new laboratory, but no one talking about it because they were all afraid we'd be put in prison. I went off to Cornell for 8 months before shipping out in the Merchant Marine before the Navy V-12 could capture me to stay in school for the war.
In 45, when the nuclear bomb was exploded in Hiroshima and the news came on the radio, the captain of that ship kind of knew I knew something about something, or I was an electrician, asked me to go to the wardroom, the mess hall, and try and explain to people what this meant. I'd never met the captain before, but so I gave a short lecture on how to make a nuclear bomb, because I'd naturally been thinking about it. You can't have left this place and know that it was making a nuclear bomb and never talk about it, then it blows off without damn well knowing how it works, because you're going to be a physicist in life. And I did become a physicist. I went to Cornell and got my PhD with all those people that made the bomb here. You know, Beta and Morrison, and Wilson was my advisor. It was more or less foregone in my head that I would, come back to the labs in some fashion. I went to Berkeley first and then Livermore. But I very soon got into managing the nuclear testing part, the nuclear measurements of the big first operable thermonuclear weapons. When I mean operable, I mean that you could field them, take them on a plane. And the biggest of those was the Bravo test in 54, I think, 53, 54 it was. And I was in charge of the fast diagnostics, the neutrons, gamma rays, stuff like that. But for Los Alamos, when I was working in Livermore.
Herb York said, well, sorry, Stirling, we have a job to do for the start of this laboratory. We have to show cooperation with Los Alamos. I need you to take charge of the diagnostics on that experiment. It just turned out that it was very fortunate that I had spent my thesis in gamma ray absorption measurements and so understood about in and out scattering of a beam. And this then became a defining part of doing an experiment to measure what goes on. The problem in measuring the gamma rays from a nuclear bomb of the size of megatons was that in order for the recording equipment to survive, it had to be at least 2 miles from the bomb itself. And anytime anything were closer than that, then the constant recoil current in any cables would outrun any signal.
In the Ivy Mike test 2 years before, which was the first successful full-scale thermonuclear explosion, scientists had failed to measure the gamma rays. That was a great disappointment. The gamma ray flux, if measured with good time resolution, provides a time history of the nuclear reactions in the device, both fission and fusion, and in particular, a time history of the criticality of the device, a quantity known as alpha. For weapons designers, the prediction of alpha is of critical importance. And as Stirling liked to say, it is one of the most exotic calculations, requiring simultaneous modeling of the hydrodynamics and the transport, absorption, and multiplication of neutrons by fission and fusion burn. But measuring the gamma ray signal is also a feat. because the intensity varies over many orders of magnitude. In Ivy Mike, they had tried to reduce the gamma scattering due to the air by creating a pathway of helium-filled bags between the collimators that were lined up between bomb and detectors. Stirling recognized that the strategy had failed because there was still too much scattering in the helium. And so, as Stirling put it, he was forced to eliminate most of the scattering by creating a rough vacuum between the bomb and the detectors. This was an incredible engineering feat because, recall, he was pulling a vacuum on not just one, but a dozen 2-mile-long pipes. Only Stirling could think a 2-mile-long vacuum was a reasonable idea.
The engineering group at Livermore soon decided the bunker had to have 8-foot walls of concrete and rebar. And so that bunker was designed and built, and the cable entrances and all of that were very complicated to make sure that no Compton recoil currents blasted the inside of the bunker. But then, of course, we had to decide what was the important thing to measure about the bomb and its future. The whole thing did work, but not without some very, very scary, many scary moments. The first scary moment was when we got out to the Pacific with the tests 2 months away and found that our big cobalt-60 gamma ray source we couldn't see at the far end of the pipeline. And so endless recriminating arguments with Holmes and Arbor. The gamma rays don't go in a straight line and things like that. But fortunately we had, with Ted Merkel at his recommendation, backed this whole system up with a telescope and an optical flap. And so we then went about straightening one pipeline, inserting lights, and finding out how much we had to move the pipeline position. That night, in the middle of the night, the young engineer from Los Alamos came and woke me up and said, "Stirling, I've plotted the corrections that they had to use to bring the pipeline straight, and I've plotted them out as a function of position along the pipeline. And I'm wondering what these corrections might mean to you." I woke up in a jerk and looked at him. I don't think it took any longer than it took to recognize Oppie's pork pie hat. What he was showing me was the curvature of the Earth. Holmes and Arbor had forgotten that the Earth was round and made the pipeline level to the Earth, not straight. And a few short calculation with a perpendicular bisector convinced me that the radius of curvature was of the order of 6,000 kilometers. So there was just absolutely no question that the pipelines had been made level, not straight. The contractors were exceedingly embarrassed. My job as a leader was to say, "Hey, forget that. We got to work together to get this done." But I did want the X-rated movies reestablished. And everyone worked twice as hard to get everything to work and get it done. And it all was very successful. Another engineer, Jim Bell, said, "Stirling, I was looking through some of the pictures of the tests and the Damara test site. And what do these spikes mean coming down these cables that have, a big 10-foot diameter hole blown in the ground at the end of the guy cables after a test?" I said, "Jim, I've heard that they were made by the electrical signal caused by the Compton recoil current of the gamma rays on the cable proceeding at the speed of light, and all that current being concentrated and blowing a hole. Coming to think of it, that's a crazy explanation. None of us could figure out what the hell it was. These gigantic spikes of energy coming down the guy wires. The beauty of the honesty of physics and science is that you can't say you understand unless you give a very good scientific reason, and no one could. So it didn't take much of a calculation to scale the phenomena to what would happen. Instead of a guy wire, a dozen steel pipelines 2 miles long, and asking how they would act in the same way. And it would be of the order of a kiloton of yield of explosion at the blockhouse. And that certainly would take out the blockhouse and all the equipment and all the recording, and there'd be whole experiment would be a failure. So, what to do? Well, we sort of knew about explosives and what happens when you bury an explosive on the ground, how much rock and dirt and sand get blown in the air. In the mining industry, that's called the powder ratio. If we had a kiloton and a powder ratio of 100, we would need 100 kilotons, 100,000 tons of coral on the blockhouse to shield it from the equivalent spike coming down the pipelines. Naturally, I was scared, deeply scared, that we would lose the whole experiment. So I went to Bill Ogle, who was test director, and I said, Bill, we don't know the origin of this major phenomenon. If it were to happen along this pipeline, poof, it'd be the end of the blockhouse. So I would like to organize with Holmes and Arbor that we put 100,000 tons of coral sand on top of the blockhouse and ahead of it up the pipeline. He said, Stirling, that'll delay the test a week. And I said, yes, sir, and you'll have to make that call. It's a fantastically large fireball 40 miles away, filled the whole sky. We had to drop down below the bulkhead because the radiation, thermal radiation, was so great. And then after that went away, then we could see the shock wave coming across the ocean. When the shock hit the ship, it rocked it back and forth. Then one had to worry about fallout and radioactivity. It was a mess. Even though the yield of the device was twice, extra sand and coral saved the blockhouse. Big fireball that traveled down the pipeline that one could see in the optical photographs from 20 miles away. The size of the fireball that landed on the blockhouse was between 1 to 2 kilotons. It survived even though it was displaced many feet. After 2 days, when things had quieted down, we went in with helicopters, recovered the film in lead containers, went back to the ships. It looked like everything was going to be a success.
The gamma ray signal was measured successfully, and the values obtained became used at Los Alamos and Livermore for many years, serving as a standard measure, to quote Stirling, a critical franca against which to test the output of our codes. After the Bravo test, Stirling finally got to work on plasma physics for Project Sherwood, the U.S. effort to transform thermonuclear fusion into an almost inexhaustible power source. The effort was made public at the Atoms for Peace Conference in Geneva in 1958. The Bravo test, with over twice the expected yield and a much larger area of dangerous fallout, woke up the world to the dangers of atmospheric nuclear testing. And the very next year, the four nuclear powers, the Soviet Union, the US, Britain, and France, were in Geneva at the negotiating table trying to develop a treaty to stop nuclear testing. Soviet objections to on-site inspections to monitor underground testing brought the talks to a standstill. But then, in 1957, Sputnik opened up the space age, and satellites became a potential means to verify a partial test ban treaty banning tests in space, in the atmosphere, and underwater. In 1959, Herb York and Teller prevailed upon Stirling to become a scientific advisor to the State Department and join the test ban negotiations at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. As Stirling said, for some reason they thought a younger, inexperienced dude like me might be just the thing to help with the Soviets.
Well, the Soviet delegation was about 5 super able senior scientists. Mr. Charles Stell, who was head of the mission and the real brains behind all the negotiations on test ban treaties, came to me one day and he said, "Stirling, our primary problem is to get the Soviets to agree to some kind of inspection. I don't know what the best tactics for that is, but we're building a treaty in which there is absolutely no way to check whether the other guy is cheating. So what can you think of that would push the Soviets to agree to satellite observations? They're paranoid about being spied on. That's because there's so much of their power had come by spying on others. A very simple algorithm." I suggested, well, supposing something happened out in space that mimicked a nuclear bomb, and he wanted to know what the hell that would be, and so I popped off that it might be a supernova, because I'd done some work with Montgomery Johnson on supernova explosions by then. And he said, "Stirling, do you think you could make that appear real to those high-powered Soviet scientists?" Well, I said it's worth a shot, so I worked for a while on how a supernova might mimic a nuclear bomb. So I came up with a scenario of how to mimic a hydrogen bomb test with a possible signal from a supernova explosion. So Charlie said, "Stirling, I'm going to have you give a chalk talk on this for about 45 minutes to the joint delegations. And you've got to sell the Soviet scientists that this is a reasonable possibility, and we want to end up negotiating a treaty in which we both agree, in essence, to spy on each other with satellites. That is, have satellites so capable that we can expect to be able to visually and with gamma ray and X-ray detectors have a very good solid chunk of information about what each was up to." And he said, if we can get anywhere near that, it will be a major step ahead. So I gave the talk, and this whole thing caught them totally by surprise. So they all huddled together afterwards, and after about 20 minutes, their extremely capable ambassador, Serapkin, came out, and Serapkin said, "Well, we've decided who knows what a supernova is. We'll have a 2-week recess while we consider all of this." Of course, my immediate reaction, I'm going to show you what a supernova is. And of course, that made my career in astrophysics. And so when we reconvened, to the immense relief and surprise of the American delegation, the Soviets were in essence agreeing to capable satellites to view each other. And those, of course, were the Vela satellites for us. To this day, I feel it was the start of perestroika. It was where the Soviet Union had to agree that it would be more stable and safer for them, for both the US and them, to have capable satellites in orbit, able to, quote, spy on each other. And of course, sometime later, several years, a treaty was signed agreeing to no nuclear bomb testing in space. Well, those same satellites, when I was now good many years later president at New Mexico Tech, saw these weird events of flashes of gamma rays in space that we now call gamma ray bursts. And so this is still an open field of scientific research, is to figure out how the gamma ray bursts that we see flashing throughout our whole universe really occur. And so out of discussions leading to the security of our nuclear weapons and the security of our culture not to use them, evolved not just the perestroika, but gamma ray bursts, the brightest things that happen in our universe, a challenge to remind us constantly of our inability to understand.
What is it that has meant most about the scientific discipline to you? In other
Well,
words,
personally or
what
the
do
big
you-
picture?
Well, let's
Personally, the biggest thing is the presumption for the remainder of my life, always, of never being bored, of being able to work to the utmost capacity of my mind and body. And that's a privilege of being a scientist that is absolutely incomparable to me. In order to get a good signal from the rockets as we're mounting them, we have to have the antenna on, otherwise we don't get a good RF signal. Okay. Each rocket has to be mounted separately and checked as you're mounting it that everything works. The final pre-flight means checking all the connections that they're right, the elastic bands are in place, and finally pre-flighting the plane for takeoff. Final call to NSSL. Number 9 rocket ready to fire, and this is a view just before firing. Okay, 3, 2, 1, fire. And it went pretty dang well.